Office questions. We now come to the statement. I now call the Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, before I start, I'd like to express my deepest sympathy, and I'm sure that of the whole House, on the death of your father. He was a true giant, not just of this House, but of the other place too. I also want to express my solidarity with our Australian friends after the horrific and senseless attacks in Sydney in recent days. Our thoughts are with all those affected. Mr. Speaker, on Saturday evening, Iran sought to plunge the Middle East into a new crisis. They launched a barrage of missiles and attack drones over Iraq and Jordan and towards Israel. The scale of the attack and the fact that it was targeted directly at Israel are without precedent. It was a reckless and dangerous escalation. If it had succeeded, the fallout for regional security and the toll on Israeli citizens would have been catastrophic. But, Mr. Speaker, it did not succeed. In support of Israel's own defensive action, the United Kingdom joined a US-led international effort, along with France and partners in the region, which intercepted almost all of the missiles, saving lives in Israel and its neighbours. We sent additional RAF Typhoons to the region as part of our existing operations against Daesh in Iraq and Syria. And I can confirm our forces destroyed a number of Iranian drones. We also provided important intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance support for our partners. Mr. Speaker, our pilots put themselves in harm's way to protect the innocent and preserve peace and stability. I spoke to the RAF earlier today. They are the best of the best, and I know the whole House will join me in expressing our gratitude. Mr. Speaker, with this attack, Iran has once again shown its true colours. They are intent on sowing chaos in their own backyard, on further destabilising the Middle East. Our aim is to support stability and security, because it is right for the region, and because, although the Middle East is thousands of miles away, it has a direct effect on our security and prosperity at home. So we are working urgently with our allies to de-escalate the situation and prevent further bloodshed. We want to see calmer heads prevail, and we are directing all our diplomatic efforts to that end. Yesterday, I spoke to my fellow G7 leaders. We are united in our condemnation of this attack. We discussed further potential diplomatic measures, which we will be working together to coordinate in the coming days. I will also shortly be speaking to Prime Minister Netanyahu to express our solidarity with Israel in the face of this attack and to discuss how we can prevent further escalation. All sides must show restraint. Mr. Speaker, our action reflects our wider strategy in the Middle East, which I have set out in this House previously. I believe there are three vital steps to put the region onto a better path. First, we must uphold regional security against hostile actors, including in the Red Sea, and we must ensure Israel's security. That is non-negotiable. It is a fundamental condition for peace in the region. In the face of threats like we saw this weekend, Israel has our full support. Second, we must invest more deeply in the two-state solution. That is what we have been doing over the past 6 months, including working closely with the Palestinian Authority, so that when the time comes, they can provide more effective governance for Gaza and the West Bank. Mr. Speaker, it is significant that other regional partners actually helped to prevent a much worse attack over the weekend. It reminds us how important the attempts to normalise relations between Israel and its neighbours really are, and it holds out precious hope for the region. Third, Mr. Speaker, the conflict in Gaza must end. Hamas, which is backed by Iran, started this war. They wanted not just to kill and murder, but to destabilise the whole region. This weekend, they rejected the latest hostage deal, which offered a road to a ceasefire. It is Israel's right, and indeed its duty, to defeat the threat from Hamas terrorists and defend its security. And I want to be clear, nothing that has happened over the last 48 hours affects our position on Gaza. The appalling toll on civilians continues to grow. The hunger, the desperation, the loss of life on an awful scale. The whole country wants to see an end to the bloodshed and to see more humanitarian support going in. The recent increase in aid flows is positive, but it is still not enough. We need to see new crossings open for longer to get in vital supplies. And, Mr. Speaker, I want to take this opportunity to pay tribute to the 3 British aid workers who were killed in Gaza: John Chapman, James Kirby, and James Henderson. They were heroes. The children of Gaza, who they were risking their lives to feed, need a humanitarian pause immediately, leading to a long-term sustainable ceasefire. That is the fastest way to get hostages out and aid in, and to stop the fighting. Israelis and Palestinians alike deserve to live in peace, dignity, and security, and so do people across the entire region. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, Saturday's attack was the act not of a people, but of a despotic regime. And it is emblematic of the dangers that we face today. The links between such regimes are growing. Tel Aviv was not the only target of Iranian drones on Saturday. Putin was also launching them at Kyiv and Kharkiv. And who was the sole voice speaking up for Iran yesterday, seeking to justify their actions? Russia. The threats to stability are growing, not just in the Middle East, but everywhere. And we are meeting those threats time after time, with British forces at the forefront. It's why our pilots were in action this weekend. It's why they have been policing the skies above Iraq and Syria for a decade. It's why our sailors are defending the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea against the reckless attacks of the Iran-backed Houthi militia. It's why our soldiers are on the ground in Kosovo, Estonia, Poland, and more. And it's why we have led the way in backing Ukraine and will continue to back them for as long as it takes. When adversaries like Russia or Iran threaten peace and prosperity, we will always stand in their way, ready to defend our values and our interests, shoulder to shoulder with our friends and our allies. And I commend this statement to the House.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for advance copy of his statement and for the regular briefings on the developing situation in the Middle East. I also thank the Prime Minister for his warm tribute to your father, Mr. Speaker, Doug Hoyle, a great servant of our party, respected by all who knew him. I also join the Prime Minister in offering our solidarity with the victims of the horrific attack in Sydney and in recognising the heroism of the 3 British aid workers killed in Gaza while working for World Kitchen. Turning to the events of this weekend, we support the defensive action taken by the UK over the weekend alongside our international allies against the Iranian attacks on Israel, and we welcome the Prime Minister's call for restraint. Once again, we all salute the professionalism and bravery of our armed forces. We also support the RAF planes being sent to the region to bolster Operation Shader. Their efforts are vital for a safer world. Mr. Speaker, there can be no doubt that the attack perpetrated by Iranian forces this weekend has left the world a more dangerous place. It targeted innocent civilians with a clear intent to destabilise the region. It must be wholly condemned by all. But, Mr. Speaker, let us also be clear. A full-scale conflict in the Middle East is in no one's interests. It is a path that can only lead to more bloodshed, more instability, and the unleashing of forces that are beyond the ability of anyone to control. Mr. Speaker, the combined defensive action this weekend was a success, and because of that, lives were saved. As a result, escalation is not inevitable. In repelling the attack, Israel showed strength and courage. It must now show the same strength and courage to de-escalate. That has to be the primary objective. And, Mr. Speaker, that is the responsibility of all sides and every partner. We must be resolute and united in our support for the collective security of Israel, Jordan and other partners in the region. But tensions remain very high. We must proceed calmly, carefully and with restraint. Because if diplomacy takes centre stage, and it must, then we also need to be clear, diplomatic premises should not be targeted and attacked. That is a point of principle. But as the condemnation from our G7 allies rightly notes, Iran's response this weekend was unprecedented, a further step towards the destabilisation of the region and the risk of escalation. And nobody in this House should be or is under any illusion. This is a regime that sponsors terror across the Middle East and beyond, that murders and represses its own people and supports Putin's war efforts in Ukraine. So can the Prime Minister update the House on any new steps he's taking with our international partners to pursue sanctions against the regime? And can he clarify what steps he's taking to limit the power of the Revolutionary Guard to glorify terrorism here in the UK? Mr. Speaker, whilst there is no justification for Iran's actions, we cannot be naive to the fact that one of the drivers of tension in the region is the ongoing war in Gaza. 6 months on from the horrific Hamas terror attack, hostages remain separated from their families. Thousands of innocent Palestinians have been killed. And now more than 1 million people face the imminent threat of famine. So I urge the government again to use every ounce of diplomatic leverage that we have to make sure aid to Gaza is unimpeded and drastically scaled up. Alongside that, we reiterate our call for an immediate ceasefire, for Hamas to release hostages, and for a return to a diplomatic process that can rekindle the hope of a two-state solution. Mr. Speaker, it is right that we condemn Iran's action. It is right that we work with others to defend the security of our allies. And it is right that we seek the end of conflict in Gaza. But this is a moment for restraint, because escalation will only lead to further destruction. And for the sake of all those still caught in the horror and violence, that must be avoided. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman for his support of the government's actions. With regard to what might happen going forward, ultimately Israel has a right to self-defence, as any state does, and the G7 leaders spoke yesterday and unequivocally condemned Iran's attack and expressed full solidarity and support to Israel and its people. But as the Foreign Secretary said this morning, this is a time to be smart as well as tough. Israel has incredibly successfully repelled the Iranian attack, and Iran is even more isolated on the world stage. And as others have said, we would urge them to take the win at this point. We want to avoid further escalation and bloodshed. He's right that it would be deeply destabilising for the region and risks more lives, and all our diplomatics at this point will be geared towards that goal in partnership with our allies. Next, just turning to Iran, the behaviour of the Iranian regime, as I've said previously, including the actions of the IRGC, poses a significant threat to the safety and security of the UK and our allies. And yesterday at the G7, we agreed to work together on further measures to counter the Iranian regime and its proxies. It was agreed that we should coordinate those actions, and that work is now underway. And obviously, at the appropriate time, either I or ministers will update the House. We have already sanctioned, as he will know, over 400 Iranian individuals, including the IRGC in its entirety. We have a new sanctions regime to enable us gives us more extensive powers to designate sanctions that we put in place at the end of last year. And of course, the National Security Act, it creates new offences for espionage and foreign interference, and means that our security services have the powers that they need to deter, disrupt and detect threats of a more modern nature from states like Iran. And lastly, with regard to diplomacy for Israel and the region, we're absolutely committed to a two-state solution and working very hard, using all our efforts to bring that about, particularly over the last few months, building up the capability, as I said, of the Palestinian Authority so that they have the technical and administrative capability that is necessary when the moment comes for them to provide effective governance in the West Bank and Gaza. It is absolutely my view and the government's view that Israelis and Palestinians should have the opportunity to live side by side in peace, with security, dignity and opportunity, and I'm proud of the role that the United Kingdom is playing.
Foreign Affairs Select Committee, Alicia. Kearns.
Mr. Speaker, my condolences on the loss of your father. This remains a very dangerous moment, and yet over the weekend we saw a demonstration of unity and purpose. We saw the depth of will for normalisation and for a secure future for all peoples of the Middle East. Restraint is vital if we want to build on the momentum, to get hostages home to their families, to get improvements to continue on aid. But to better protect our people, will my right honourable friend commit to launch a new consensus on Iran with our allies and a new effort with a combined diplomatic, military and wider experts areas to limit the extent of the atrocities of Iran? We need to end the compartmentalisation of the threats when we deal with them. We must deal with them as one, whether it be nuclear ambitions, the arming of the militia, femicide or transnational repression. But only with a new consensus will we see that progress. So will he please commit to leading that internationally?
Mr. Speaker, I can give the Honourable Lady that commitment, and that is exactly the subject of our discussions yesterday amongst G7 leaders. And she mentioned nuclear. Iran's nuclear programme has never been more advanced than it is today and threatens international peace and security. And there is absolutely no justification for this, at a civilian level, for the enrichment that we are seeing that the IAEA has reported in Iran, and I want to reassure her that we are considering next steps on the nuclear file with our international partners, and we are committed to using all diplomatic tools available to ensure that Iran never develops a nuclear weapon, including using the snapback mechanism if necessary.
SNP spokesperson Mhairi Black.
I want to echo the Prime Minister in not only passing on our thoughts to you, Mr Speaker, but also to the families of those aid workers who have been killed in Gaza. Now, I want to begin by condemning the acts of violence by the Iranian regime. These acts are no more than a cynical attempt to exploit the suffering, the pain and the turmoil being experienced by those people in Palestine right now. And whilst we rightly condemn the violent acts of Iran, so too must we condemn the violent acts of Israel. Listening to the interviews that he's been given, the Foreign Secretary is correct in his attempt to uphold the principle of proportionality. But if 100 missiles in retaliation to an isolated attack on an embassy is correctly constitutes as disproportionate, then so too must Israel's 192 days bombardment of Gaza. Now, we know that the agenda in Tehran is to bring about as much instability as possible. We all have a responsibility to ensure that that does not happen. There is not going to be a military solution to the conflict in the Middle East. There must be a political and diplomatic solution. So what is required now is the same as what was required 6 months ago. We need de-escalating and the causes of conflict in the region to be reviewed. Now, the biggest continuing cause of conflict is the siege of Gaza, hence the need for a ceasefire. So can the Prime Minister outline what he is doing to ensure that the UN Security Council mandated ceasefire becomes a reality?
Mr. Speaker, I think first of all it's important not to try and draw any equivalence between Israel Israel's absolute right, indeed duty, to provide security for its citizens in the face of an appalling terrorist atrocity, and indeed what happened over the weekend. These things are just not remotely the same. So we will more broadly, though, as I've said repeatedly from this dispatch box, urge Israel to abide by international humanitarian law. We've been very clear that too many civilians have been killed, and we're deeply concerned about the impact on the civilian population in Gaza, and our diplomatic efforts are geared towards alleviating that suffering, and I'll continue to raise these points with Prime Minister Netanyahu when I speak to him. But as I said, drawing equivalence between these two things is absolutely the not right thing to do.
Absolutely. Of the Defence Select Committee, Jeremy Quin. Notwithstanding the sheer scale of the Iranian attack, multi-layered air defence proved effective. Are we ensuring that any learnings we picked up we're passing on to Ukraine for the use of their own defence? And in a more hostile and dangerous world, and with the ever-increasing proliferation of missile and drone technology, are we reviewing our own air defence assets and capabilities to support our allies and indeed closer to home if ever required?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for an excellent question. He's right about the importance of air defence, which is why it has repeatedly been one of the key capabilities that we have sought to provide to Ukraine, something that we have led on for some time, and ditto with some of the new contracts that we've placed most recently this year to replenish UK stockpiles, also cover air defence missiles. He's more broadly right that we need to ensure that our industrial production here in the UK is geared to produce the capabilities that we need, whether it's for our own use or for Ukraine's use, and I'm pleased to say the Defence Secretary is working with the industry to ensure that supply chain is there to meet those needs.
Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I send you and your family our deepest condolences on the loss of your father? And can I associate myself and my colleagues with the comments of others about the appalling murders in Sydney and the death of the aid workers in Gaza? Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement? The Liberal Democrats join him in condemning Iran's attack on Israel. This is an alarming escalation in a conflict that has already seen far too many deaths and suffering. So we support the action taken by the RAF to intercept Iranian drones as we stand up for Israel's security. Mr. Speaker, we also worry about what Prime Minister Netanyahu and his government will do next. The Prime Minister rightly says we must prevent further escalation. So does he agree that the best way to achieve that is to press all sides to agree to an immediate bilateral ceasefire in Gaza, to get the hostages home, to get the aid in, and put us on the path to a lasting peace for a two-state solution?
Mr. Speaker, we've repeatedly called for an immediate humanitarian pause so that we can get the hostages out and more aid in, and use that as the foundation to build a more lasting and sustainable ceasefire. But it is worth pointing out, which hasn't been mentioned by colleagues so far, that Hamas have yet again rejected another offer to release hostages, and it's important that we don't lose sight of that. We must have the hostages released as part of any of those conversations, and it was Hamas yet again over the weekend who have rejected the latest round of those talks.
Sir Liam Fox.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend for the leadership he's shown on this issue and echo his call for the need to avoid a spiral of escalation. But we've seen a military attack by Iran on a nation which its regime believes should not exist at all. Iran has directly or indirectly engineered a war in Gaza with the aim of thwarting better relations between Arab states and Israel, especially Saudi Arabia. We now have death and destruction in Gaza in a conflict that no one can win, and where the only beneficiaries are Iran, its proxies and its allies. We've seen an Iranian journalist attacked on British soil, and we've seen an international vessel being pirated by the IRGC in international waters, another vile example of hostage-taking. So I ask my right honourable friend again, why are Iranians still operating out of Heathrow? Why are Iranian banks still operating in the City of London? When will the snapback mechanism be invoked? And what can be done to stop the export of Iranian oil to Russia and other countries, which is now keeping the regime afloat?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his leadership on this issue over a consistent period of time, and he's right to highlight the threats that Iran poses to us. I want to reassure him that on all the areas that he mentioned, active work has been undertaken by the government. As I mentioned in my statement, we discussed yesterday on the G7 call the need and benefit of coordinating further measures, perhaps including some of the things that he talked about, amongst allies in order to have maximum impact both on the regime and on the ultimate designations of any future sanctions. I'm pleased that our new sanctions regime that we implemented at the end of last year gives us extensive new powers. I'm keen to make sure we use them to good effect, but where we can coordinate those with allies, I know he'd agree with me that that would be preferable, and I can reassure him that that work is happening at pace.
Sir George Howarth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I too pass on my condolences for the loss of your dad, Doug? I was one of those who, on many occasions, benefited from his wise advice. There is no, as the Prime Minister said, there is no moral equivalence between two sides in this, what's happening in Gaza and what happened in the attacks by Iran on Israel. It is the case, though, that Israel has made mistakes in the past and should be held to account for them. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that as things move on, the importance of neighbouring states, particularly, for example, Jordan, is going to be vital, not just in resolving the current difficulties, but also in resolving a long-term future which brings about a two-state solution?
In a word, yes, I pay tribute to the King of Jordan for the leadership role that he has played over the past several months. We are fortunate to enjoy a strong working relationship with the Jordanians, which was on display yet again over this weekend, and I commend him and his country for what they've done.
Suella Braverman.
Mr. Speaker, please accept my condolences on the loss of your father.
Yeah.
2 weeks ago, Mr. Speaker, I was in Israel at the northern border with Lebanon. And of course, we've all seen what happened this weekend. But since October the 7th, Iran-backed Hezbollah has fired over 4,000 rockets into northern Israel, displacing over 150,000 Israeli civilians. I met some of those families. They're under siege, they've been uprooted, but they are brave and defiant in the face of terrorism and anti-Semitism. Mr. Speaker, we have known for years that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is the world's chief sponsor of terrorism,
Hear, hear.
funding and promoting terrorist plots, radicalisation and hostage-taking both in the Middle East and at home. Mr. Speaker, we have proscribed Hamas. We have proscribed Hezbollah. Prime Minister, why don't we put the UK's... Prime Minister, why don't we put the UK's national security first by now prescribing the IRGC?
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Lady knows, that we don't comment on any potential prescription decisions, but of course we recognise the threat from Iran and have taken measures to counter it at home and around the world. I obviously refer her to my previous answer, but I'm confident the police, security services and courts all have the tools that they need to sanction, prosecute and mitigate the threats from Iran. We've strengthened our sanctions regime recently, and including sanctioning the IRGC in its entirety.
Rushanara Ali.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the calls for a ceasefire here in our Parliament and across the international community, the war in Gaza has raged, costing 33,000 lives, as well as the 1,200 killed by Hamas attacks, and a humanitarian catastrophe that is now turning to a famine. For months, many have raised the spectre of the concern around regional escalation. Can the Prime Minister say more about precisely what conversations he's having with the leading figures in the Israeli government, as well as through various parties, to influence the Iranian regime to de-escalate as quickly as possible, given the seriousness of the crisis?
Well, both the Defence Secretary and Foreign Secretary have spoken to their counterparts over the weekend, including the Foreign Secretary has spoken to the Iranian Foreign Minister specifically to urge de-escalation and condemn what happened over the weekend. I'm speaking to Prime Minister Netanyahu shortly, and I can reassure her and all members of the House that we will continue, together with our allies, to urge calm heads to prevail and de-escalation. We think that's the right course forward, and as I said, across all levels of government, that's the message that we were taking to everyone.
Ben Wallace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is another country that is under almost constant daily bombardment by Iranian-made drones. That country is Ukraine. Some 3 years ago, I pleaded with the Israelis to help Ukraine against Russia, and they refused, even though Russia was spending $500 million in the Iranian drone program. I know the Prime Minister is speaking to the Prime Minister of Israel later today. Now that RAF pilots have quite rightly gone to the defence of Israel, could he perhaps ask that Israel now decides that it is time to help Ukraine in their hour of need, and we can see off both Russia and Iranian aggression?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for the role he's played in ensuring UK security and that of our allies over previous years. He's right, as my statement alluded to as well. The Ukrainians are suffering from Iranian drones over the same weekend that this happened. And I'm also pleased, not only will I take up his points of always with all our allies, urging them to do more to support Ukraine, I know he will have welcomed the recent announcement a few weeks ago of more support from the UK to Ukraine, specifically in the areas of uncrewed platforms on autonomous warfare, to make sure that the Ukrainians both have the ability they need to protect themselves and conduct their operations. And the majority of the 10,000 new platforms that we are delivering to the Ukrainians will have been developed in the UK, which I know is something that he was keen to ensure that we saw the benefits of here at home. I'm glad that has been realised, supporting Ukraine in their security and bolstering the British defence industry here at home.
John McDonnell.
There's consensus across the House, rightfully so, to call for restraint on the Israeli government. But we've called for restraint before. We called for restraint with regard to the attack on Gaza, yet the indiscriminate bombing took place. We called for restraint on the settlements in the West Bank, and yet the settlements have expanded. We called for a restraint so that food could be got to the children of Gaza, and yet malnutrition is killing some of them. So what action will the government take if Israel does not show restraint? Because we're in danger of the Middle East being set alight by the decisions taken by the right-wing factions within the Netanyahu cabinet.
Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry, I missed the part of the honourable gentleman's question where he condemned Iran and Hamas for what they've done. But we will always encourage de-escalation in the region, and I'm proud of the role the UK is playing to bring that about.
Kit Malta.
Speaker, the Prime Minister was quite right to authorise the defence of Israel and the avoidance of violence and death. But violence has also erupted in the West Bank, as he will know over the last few days. What concrete steps can we take to protect those civilians too?
Mr. Speaker, the issue of settler violence in the West Bank is something that I have personally repeatedly raised with Prime Minister Netanyahu, as indeed have my colleagues, including the Deputy Foreign Minister, and we have joined with allies in sanctioning activity of particular individuals where it has been brought to our attention, and we will continue to ensure that the Israeli government does everything it can to reduce tensions in the West Bank. We don't think it's conducive to long-term peace in the region, and that's why I said we've taken action where we can, as well as being very explicit about our concerns with the Israeli government.
George Galloway.
Mr. Speaker, I knew your father well for a very long time. He was a fine man, and I am sincerely sorry for your loss. There was not one single word in the Prime Minister's statement of condemnation of the Israeli destruction of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, which is the proximate reason for the event everyone is here in concert condemning. He was not even asked to do so by the front bench opposite. Kay Burley is the only person so far to demand that of a government minister. We have no treaty with Israel, at least not one that Parliament has been shown. And the Iranians are not likely to listen to him when Britain occupied Iran, looted its wealth, and overthrew its one democratic socialist government in my own lifetime.
Well, Mr. Speaker, whatever may have happened a few weeks ago, it is absolutely no justification for launching more than 300 drones and missiles from one sovereign state towards Israel. It's as simple as that. And in the honourable gentleman's question, not once did he condemn that action, or indeed the actions of Hamas in the region. There is no equivalence between these things whatsoever, and to suggest otherwise is simply wrong.
Robert Holford.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his strong support for the State of Israel. Last year, as Israel and Saudi Arabia were about to strike a transformational agreement, Iran-backed Hamas carried out its massacre on October the 7th with the aim of torpedoing the chance of peace between Israel and the Arab nations. And last Saturday's drone attack by Iran, being thwarted by Israel and her allies, including Jordan, demonstrated that Arab countries can work alongside Israel after this new period of contention. So does my right honourable friend agree that this represents a new opportunity for Israel and the Arab nations to rebuild relations in the aftermath of October 7th and bring the hostages home?
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend. It is significant that other regional partners actually helped to prevent a much worse attack over the weekend, and it reminds us how important attempts are to normalise relations between Israel and its neighbours. It holds out precious hope for the region. It's exactly that hope that Iran and its proxies are trying to snuff out, and we should work very hard to combat that.
John Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my condolences to you and your family, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, I condemn Iran and Hamas, let me start there. But we must not lose focus on the situation in Gaza, where there is a humanitarian crisis, famine, and it's just destruction that people are seeing in front of their eyes. But if we want to ensure that the hostages come home, like the hostage that's been adopted in Brent, Noah, Argamena, we must argue for a ceasefire and not a pause. Will the Prime Minister clearly state that we should be calling for an immediate ceasefire on all sides?
Mr. Speaker, it's wrong to suggest in any way that we have lost sight of what is happening in Gaza, and indeed the G7 statement yesterday referenced specifically our desire to cooperate to end the crisis in Gaza, working towards an immediate humanitarian pause where hostages can be released, aid can go in and build the conditions for a sustainable ceasefire, and crucially deliver more humanitarian assistance into the region. It's welcome that we have seen an increase in that flow over the past few days and weeks, but far more aid has to get in, and that's the pressure that we will continue to put on all partners concerned.
Sir Ian Duncan.
Mr. Speaker, my condolences. Can I commend my right honourable friend's statement? It's quite clear, as has been said already, that all roads lead back to Tehran when it comes to the terrible violence and the wars that take place in the Middle East. And every country, not just Israel, but other Arab countries, fear what Tehran is doing in their countries as well, the thing we forget about. Can I therefore know that if we know that they are committing murder at home, they've executed thousands of protesters whilst this war in Hamas has been taking place. So with all of that known, can I please ask my right honourable friend, when he sits down with our international colleagues and looks for other things to take place with regards to restricting Iran, please, could he now consider prescribing the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, and to do it in a way that makes sure they can no longer foment extremism here in the United Kingdom as well?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question. As I said to him, or I said in the statement, we are urgently working with our allies to see what steps we can take together in a coordinated fashion to deter and condemn what Iran is doing. With regard to destabilising activity here in the UK, he'll know that the Charities Commission very recently have opened an investigation to a particular organisation, and we will continue to use all the powers at our disposal to make sure that people aren't fomenting hate and undermining British values here at home from abroad.
Sarah Sultan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've notified the office of the member for Rutland and Melton that I would be referencing her in my question. It was recently revealed that the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee told a private fundraising event, and I quote, "The Foreign Office has received official legal advice that Israel has broken international humanitarian law, but the government has not announced it." So I have a very simple question for the Prime Minister, and if he can't answer that, if he dodges and if he deflects, our constituents will know that he is hiding the truth. Was the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee telling the truth, yes or no?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to address this very clearly. We have one of the most robust arms export licensing control regimes in the entire world. We have previously assessed that Israel is committed and capable of complying with IHL, but we regularly review our assessment, as she would expect. As the Foreign Secretary confirmed last week, the UK position on export licences is unchanged, and following the latest assessment is in line with our legal advice. We will keep that position under review and act in accordance with advice. And I would also point out to her that actually most like-minded countries have not suspended their existing arms export licences to Israel.
Mr. Speaker, I too welcome the Prime Minister's leadership in this area. Will he add his thanks in addition to the thanks for the RAF who have undertaken exemplary action this weekend, also those US service personnel who are based here in the United Kingdom, including many in my West Suffolk constituency, who were prepared to act at a moment's notice in order to defend the attack on Israel, which has been roundly condemned?
Well, I'm happy to join my honourable friend in paying tribute to our colleagues, not just in America, but from partners around the region who participated in a joint international effort. This was all in support of Israel's own actions, and also their armed forces deserve enormous praise for the success in which they repelled this awful attack.
Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I pass my condolences to you and your family for the sad loss of your father, Doug? We live in deeply unsettling times, and the Prime Minister is right, along with our allies, to call for a de-escalation. When the Prime Minister has these discussions with Prime Minister Netanyahu this afternoon, can he convey to him that now is the time to step back? There must be no further escalation in the Middle East. And, Mr. Speaker, now is the time to recognise that both Israelis and Palestinians must live in peace. And in order to do that, we need that two-state solution. But as the former Prime Minister David Cameron said in 2014, when we had an outbreak of violence in Gaza, he then unequivocally called for a ceasefire. We must now, today, put an end to the conflict and the killing in that region for the benefit of both these countries. And finally, if I may say so, I welcome the comments of the Prime Minister on the situation in Ukraine. But we're all aware of the reports of the build-up of Russian activity. And I ask the Prime Minister, with our allies, that we must do more today to protect our friends in Iran, to give them the tools that they need, to be able to defend themselves and to be able to make sure that Russia is defeated.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to say to our honourable gentleman that we remain steadfast in our support for Ukraine, and we will not allow Putin to achieve his aim of eradicating freedom and democracy in that country. We've announced significant support. It was the first trip that I made at the beginning of this year, and have encouraged allies to do the same. And we are committed to supporting Ukraine for as long as it takes, for not only for them to win the war, but also to emerge as a strong, sovereign and free country.
Richard, be Manchester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My thoughts and condolences are with your family. The United Kingdom stands for an international rules-based system, respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity of other nations. And that is one of our key objectives with regards to Ukraine. Of course, I condemn in the fullest Iran's attack on Israel. And I have previously condemned Iran's malign behaviour in the region. The question that is on people's mind is this: what information or intelligence does the Prime Minister have with regards to what was going on in Iran's consulate in Damascus, which led to that attack by Iran? Because the international community and people around the world want to see United Kingdom applying international law consistently across the board.
Mr. Speaker, whatever happened in that situation has not been confirmed, and regardless, there can never be any justification for launching, as I said, over 300 drones and missiles towards Israel from another sovereign country, and it was right that we took action with allies to repel that attack.
Richard Beckett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and my condolences to you on the loss of your father. He'll have been very, very proud of you. This is a very dangerous moment. The UN Secretary-General rightly told the Security Council last night, now is the time to defuse and de-escalate. Ordinary people in both Israel and Iran, across the whole region, indeed wider world, will pay the price if this escalates. The Secretary-General also rightly reiterated the call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, as the Security Council voted for, given the huge loss of life there. This is the first opportunity we've had to question the Prime Minister since the recent killing of British nationals in Gaza. So is the Prime Minister planning to appoint an independent advisor to scrutinise the Israeli inquiry into those deaths of British nationals in a similar way to the way Australia has done?
Mr. Speaker, I spoke to Prime Minister Netanyahu after that incident to express our very strong concerns about what had happened. We are carefully reviewing the initial findings of Israel's investigations into the killing of the aid workers and welcome the suspension of 2 officers as a first step. These findings must be published and followed up with an independent review to ensure the utmost transparency and accountability.
Mike Lewis.
Can I congratulate the Prime Minister for his strength defending Israel and wider peace in the Middle East? His strength in this area is world-leading. Now, our friend, this country's friend Saudi Arabia, has now said in an official statement that Iran, quote, engineered the war in Gaza, end quote, in order to destroy the progress the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was making in normalising relations with Israel. Now, that very important statement yesterday also said that Iran is a country that sponsors terrorism and it should have been stopped a long time ago. That's the Saudis saying that. So is my right honourable friend as hopeful as I am that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Israel, both allies of this country, will normalise their relations as soon as possible, as it looks like they were on track to do before the pogrom of the 7th of October?
Well, I had a very constructive meeting in Saudi Arabia with MBS at the end of last year, and I know how important it is to normalise relations between Israel and its neighbours, and it's clear from this weekend and indeed the comments that the honourable gentleman just made that there is momentum and a desire to see that happen, and it holds out, I believe, precious hope for the region.
Speaker, can I also pass our condolences from my party on to you in the loss of your dad? The UK should not either dictate or demand from Israel restrictions in how it retaliates against the Iranian regime, which has shown it's prepared to take action to back up its threats to wipe Israel out. And indeed, the political and military support which we have given is very important. But can the Prime Minister tell us what direct action can we take here in the United Kingdom to disrupt the economic interests of Iran which exists in our own country?
We've already sanctioned more than 400 Iranian individuals, Mr. Speaker, and as I said, discussing with our allies about what more we can do.
Jason McConnell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to the Royal Air Force personnel who were on operations over the weekend? I also join him as well the importance of de-escalating, calling for maximum restraint, and when it comes to Gaza, working towards that sustainable ceasefire, seeing a flood of aid going into Gaza now to help the humanitarian efforts there, and also we all want to see an end to the bloodshed. But can I just echo the chair of the Defence Select Committee in what we saw over the weekend, just showing the importance of investing in air defence systems to defend civilians from these hostile regimes?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Whether it's with Ukraine, where we've provided AMRAAMs and Starstreak missiles, or indeed here at home, where, as I said, we've placed new contracts at the beginning of this year to improve our air defence capability. It's a key capability that we need to invest in, and ideally we need to produce more of it here at home.
Abdul Khan.
Mr. Speaker, 12-year-old Zain Arouk miraculously survived Israel's bombing that killed most of his family in Gaza 3 months ago, but was killed this weekend by an aid airdrop when he was searching for scraps of food because the parachute didn't open. Zain and thousands of others would still be alive had allies like the UK and US pushed Israel to adhere to the UN resolution on ceasefire in Gaza, which would allow aid to reach starving children safely. So will the Prime Minister set out exactly what repercussions Israel will face for failing to abide by the UN Security Council motion?
Mr. Speaker, I've been very clear that too many civilians have already lost their lives in Gaza. The UN Security Council resolution also called for the unconditional release of the hostages, which, as he'll know, Hamas rejected at the weekend, and it's important that we focus on that at the same time as getting more aid in.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There's one thing right now that would do more than anything to help end the conflict in Gaza, and that's the release of all the Israeli hostages being held by Hamas. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that no matter how well-intentioned and no matter how much we all want the conflict to end as soon as possible, simply calling for an unconditional, immediate ceasefire reduces the incentive on Hamas to do the hostage deal? So long as they feel like they're winning diplomatically, it reduces pressure on them to do the right thing.
Well, I agree with my honourable friend, and I've made the same argument from the dispatch box previously. It's absolutely crucial that as part of the immediate humanitarian pause that we are calling for, not only can we get considerably more aid into Gaza to alleviate suffering that people are experiencing, we must be able to release the hostages, and that's what we're focused on doing.
Marcia de Cordova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst globally the attention is rightly focused on Israel and Iran, and we are all in agreement that the next step has to be de-escalation, the situation in Gaza is worsening every day. More than 33,000 lives have been lost, and more than 1 million will now be facing an imminent famine. Now, the UK almost stands alone in not restoring funding to UNRWA. So can the Prime Minister tell us when he will set out a clear path for funding to resume?
Mr. Speaker, together with our allies, we're reviewing the interim findings and are discussing appropriate next steps. Many partner countries have suspended funding to UNRWA after what happened, which was shocking. But in the meantime, we are considerably increasing our own aid into the region and welcome the commitments from Israel recently to increase the flow, opening new checkpoints, the port of Ashdod, the Jordan Land Corridor, Kerem Shalom. But now we want to see those commitments followed through. We all want to see more aid getting in, and that will be a focus of our conversations with Israel.
Logan.
Mr. Speaker, just on behalf of myself and your neighbours in Bolton North East, very sorry for the loss of your father. Mr. Speaker, 90% of Iranian oil exports go to China. China's increasing importance in the region now already trades 4 times the amount than compared to the United States, the GCC countries, along with Iran. What discussions is the Prime Minister planning on having with his counterpart Xi Jinping and the Foreign Secretary Wang Yi in terms of resolving an escalation in the conflict in Iran?
The Foreign Secretary recently spoke to his counterpart at exactly that topic, and more broadly, we're discussing with G7 partners and allies what further measures we can take to deal with the threat economically that Iran poses.
Nasha. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Much has been referred to by the Prime Minister and members opposite about the normalisation process between Saudi Arabia and Israel. The Saudi ambassador to this country on the 9th of January told Radio 4 that that normalisation process was subject to a 2-state solution and a fully recognised Palestine. And so I just wanted to put that on the record, and I want to remind the Prime Minister, support for any nation is not like the unconditional support that he has for his football team. When Iran acts like a rogue state in Syria, we call them out, rightfully so. When Israel taunts Iran by bombing their consulate building, knowing full well Iran will respond, risking further escalation, we must also call out Israel. What is the Prime Minister doing in his efforts to make sure that two-state solution and the recognition of Palestine is being actively pursued?
Refer the Honourable Lady to my statement where I made clear my commitment to a two-state solution and our diplomatic efforts to help bring that about.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend has made it clear that it is right and lawful to defend yourself and right and lawful for your allies to help defend you. But would he agree that it's also important to say that self-defence can be both effective and restrained, and more than that, that self-defence can be more effective in the long run when restrained, because it helps to retain the broadest coalition of those who support your position, and because it enables you to retain the moral authority to act robustly against others when you need to.
Well, I think my honourable friend put it well. Ultimately, Israel does have a right to self-defence, as any state does, but they have successfully repelled the Iranian attack, and Iran is even more isolated on the world stage, which is why, as the Foreign Secretary said, we would urge them to take the win and avoid further escalation at this moment.
Sir Chris Bryan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister is right to say that we and our allies need to be very clear-sighted about the activities of Iran and Russia. But when you consider that there are British businesses like Avon still doing business in Russia and claiming that that is because it's absolutely vital and urgent, when you consider that there is a massive shadow fleet of tankers evading Russian oil sanctions, and when you consider that many countries are importing, such as in Kazakhstan, so that they can then import into Russia, again to avoid sanctions, and when you consider that not a penny has yet gone from the sale of Abramovich's Chelsea to Ukraine, and we still haven't seized any of the multi-billion pounds of Russian state assets sitting in British banks, isn't there further that we could go?
Mr. Speaker, we and our G7 partners have repeatedly underscored that Russia's obligations under international law are clear and they must pay for the damage that they've caused to Ukraine. I believe we should be bold and pursue all routes through which immobilised Russian sovereign assets can be used to support Ukraine, in line, of course, with international law. This is something I've discussed with my G7 partners repeatedly. We've tasked finance ministers to that end, and they are reporting back ahead of the G7 summit in June, and I hope we can make further progress.
Sir Simon Clarke.
Mr. Speaker, and I would add my voice to those across the House who called for the proscription of the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. Their tentacles are wherever trouble is to be found across the Middle East, and this is the latest demonstration of their malign influence. Can my right honourable friend clarify that with the threat of war growing in a way which I think bears grave risk to us here at home, that we need to set out a timetable to bring our commitment to raise the percentage of GDP that we spend on defence to 2.5% as quickly as possible, but we need specificity as to how we're going to do so.
Well, I'm pleased, Madam Deputy Speaker, that in anticipation of the rising threat environment, we significantly increased defence spending by the largest amount since the end of the Cold War just a couple of years ago, and subsequently to that by over £11 billion, specifically to deal with inflation, strengthen our nuclear enterprise and rebuild our stockpiles. But I can reassure the House and my honourable friend that we will always continue to invest in our armed forces to keep this country safe.
Joanna Cherry.
I hold no candle for the Iranian regime, and in fact I recently co-authored a report on their disgraceful oppression of women and girls, and we concluded it amounted to gender apartheid. However, just as Iran must be held to the standards of international law, so must Israel. Now, the Prime Minister has paid tribute to the brave 3 British aid workers who were killed by the IDF. Will he condemn Israel for their wrongful killing? And will he also condemn Israel for the ongoing slaughter of innocent life in Gaza?
I'll point the Honourable Lady to my previous answers on both her questions.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Iranian drones have not only been fired towards Israel and Ukraine,
There are also bi-weekly shipments of Iranian drones arriving in Port Sudan to be used in that war, which as of today has now raged for a full year. So I'm very glad that the Prime Minister has made this statement today and is going to act first on financial sanctions and other measures. But does he agree that given that these Iranian weapons are now being used in wars in the Middle East, in Europe and in Africa, partners not only in the West but also in the global South should be deeply worried about how far the tentacles of terror from Tehran are now reaching?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend, and that's why yesterday I discussed with G7 leaders the coordinated effort amongst allies to take further measures to stem the flow of Iran's malign influence across the world, and hopefully we can coordinate that action to tackle the precise thing that she's just mentioned.
Khalid Mahmood.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I deplore the attack by the IDF on the consulate in Iraq. I further totally deplore the massive attack by Iran by launching 301 drones and missiles on Israel, knowing full well that this attack will deter from the great work that we need to do in Gaza, supporting those people who are starving, who are suffering from malnutrition, young children. We need to support them to do that. Will the Prime Minister commit to the fact that he supports no escalation in the region by any of the countries that are involved at the moment, but as he said in his statement, to concentrate on supporting young people and people that are dying in Gaza?
Prime Minister.
As I said very clearly, we've urged de-escalation and calm heads to prevail, and we continue to do everything we can to get more aid into Gaza.
Francois.
Thank you, Madam. Again on air defence, I wholly commend our RAF pilots and their superb Typhoon aircraft. But we only have 137 Typhoons. And because of budget pressures, next year the MOD plans to retire 30 of them and then sell them off, which would now be akin to selling Spitfires before the Battle of Britain. Will the Prime Minister, when he has a moment, go back to his office and place that ridiculous decision under immediate review, and at the very least put those Typhoons in a war reserve in case one day we need them for ourselves?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question. He'll know that obviously individual equipment and capability decisions will be made by Service Chief in conjunction with ministers. I'm happy to look at the point that he raised, but I do know we're also increasing our purchases of F-35 aircraft and collaborating with Japan and Italy on building the next generation of fighter aircraft, something that we are leading the world in, but also will be fantastic for British jobs here at home.
Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I do hope, as the Prime Minister said, that actually we can find a diplomatic solution, but I think we should plan for the worst. And I note that the Prime Minister in his statement said the threats to stability are growing, not just in the Middle East, but I'm using his exact quotes, everywhere. So can I ask also add, Madam Deputy Speaker, that our armed forces are running very hot at the moment. So can I ask the Prime Minister, why did he come here today to announce a significant uplift in defence spending to match the potential real and potential threats that we're now facing as our country is? And why isn't that going to add to insecurity for our country?
I'll refer the gentleman to my previous answer about the existing increase in our defence budget, not just over the last few years, but especially this year, in recognition of the increasing threats, and also just point out to him that we remain and have done over the past 10 years the second largest defence spender in NATO, behind only the US.
Ilias.
Taken by the Prime Minister and the Armed Services over the weekend. I regret to say this, but some of my constituents feel that UK support for Israel has weakened in recent weeks. So, in the light of this horrific aggression from Iran, will the Prime Minister take the opportunity to confirm that there is no backsliding and that the UK stands shoulder to shoulder with Israel as it exercises its right to defend itself from a genocidal attack?
Mr. Speaker, as I was crystal clear in my statement, we must ensure Israel's security. It's non-negotiable. It's a fundamental condition for peace in the region. And as we saw, in the face of threats like we saw this weekend, Israel will have always our full support.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like the whole House, I condemn the attack on Israel by the tyrannical Iranian regime, just as I deeply condemn the atrocities of Hamas. But I am also incredibly concerned that our Prime Minister has now pitched the UK into a perilous war, and in support of an Israeli government presided over by Netanyahu, a man who chose to bomb an Iranian embassy because he's dependent on his hard-right provocateurs. This was itself a dangerous escalation by Israel and a further breach of international law. So if the Prime Minister's priority is indeed international law and de-escalation, then why isn't he calling now for an urgent bilateral ceasefire to get the hostages home and to get the region on the path to peace?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we have called for an immediate humanitarian pause to get the hostages out and aid in, and will continue to do so. And I'm completely comfortable that what we did over the weekend was the right thing, acting together with allies to make sure that we could act in defence of Israel in the face of an unprecedented attack on its territory and people.
Sir Alex Hurlbrook.
Madam Deputy Speaker, may I congratulate my right honourable friend the Prime Minister for his holistic view to the situation taking place in Israel, Gaza and of course Iran. And may I say how glad I am that he has categorically said that we will carry on supplying the arms that Israel needs to defend itself, which has been proven to be so vital just this weekend. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that in order to try and achieve a sustainable ceasefire, that the Middle East has to confront the threat that Iran makes? Its direct influence in Yemen is having an impact on shipping through the Red Sea. That's having an impact on the war which is in Sudan, and it's having an impact in the war in Gaza and the effect on Israel and surrounding countries such as Lebanon. So may I ask my right honourable friend to do everything he can to make sure that the whole of the region recognises that Iran plays a large part in all of the suffering we're seeing in the area.
My honourable friend is right to point out Iran's support for the Houthi militia, who have carried out a series of dangerous and destabilising attacks against shipping in the Red Sea, and that's why the UK, together with allies, stood up to take action against that and are currently engaged in the multinational Operation Prosperity Guardian to further deter Houthi and Iranian aggression.
Sir Stephen Timms.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the support of the Prime Minister and the Government for the resolution on Gaza adopted recently by the United Nations Security Council. Israel is currently in breach of that resolution. How does that affect his view of the current actions of Israel in the Middle East?
That resolution also calls for the release of the hostages, which Hamas rejected just this weekend.
Davey Jones.
Deputy Speaker, further to the points made by my right honourable friends, the members for Fareham and Chingford and Woodford Green, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is not only the principal sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East, it is also active on the streets of the United Kingdom. Indeed, the Iranian journalist Purier Zerati, who was almost fatally stabbed last month, was under threat from the IRGC. And it's actually the case that IRGC officials can be seen dining out in restaurants in West London quite regularly. Whilst I fully understand that my right honourable friend will not flag up any such action in advance, can he confirm that he will take into account what I believe to be the overwhelming feeling in this House, which is that the IRGC should be proscribed as a terrorist organisation?
I'll just refer the honourable gentleman to my previous answers, but also remind him that the National Security Act creates new offences which give us the powers to arrest and detain people suspected of involvement in state threats on our soil.
Lou Bucks.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I share the hope for calm and de-escalation. Without it, the UN Secretary-General has said the Middle East faces a real danger of devastating full-scale conflict. Can the Prime Minister tell us what the parameters are of UK military involvement in the region and confirm it will remain defensive?
So, well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not going to speculate on future hypotheticals, but as I said, we have sent additional jets and air refuelling tankers to bolster our existing operation in the region, and we'll obviously keep next steps under review.
Richards.
Deputy Speaker, Iran has smuggled arms into the Middle East, including the West Bank. They've equipped and funded and trained Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis, as well as threatening British Iranians on British soil. And that doesn't even include what they have done to their own people, not least gassing Iranian schoolgirls. I thank the Prime Minister for the strong action over the weekend. Does he agree with me? We now must reconsider prescribing the IRGC as a terrorist organisation.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right to highlight the influence of Iran with missile shipments in the seas around them, and that's why I'm pleased that the United Kingdom is playing its part to practically do something about that. HMS Diamond bolstering our maritime presence in the region as we speak, but also the UK has previously interdicted the supply of Iranian missiles being smuggled to the Houthis and others, both last year and the year before, and will continue to be vigilant in the area.
Alicia Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I hope that the Prime Minister has heard the very strong and broad consensus that there is in this House now on the need for stability and de-escalation. So when he speaks to Prime Minister Netanyahu, will he make it clear to him that if Israel were now to proceed with their much-anticipated attack on Rafah, then that would not only be a humanitarian catastrophe for the 1.5 million Palestinians who are sheltering there, would make the release of the hostages more difficult, but would also make that stability and de-escalation more difficult to achieve, and as a consequence will not have the support of his government.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we repeatedly raised humanitarian concerns with the Israeli government, and the Foreign Secretary set out just the other week our views on the situation in Rafah.
John Whittingdale.
It is 2 weeks since the journalist working for Iran International was attacked on the streets of our own capital, and the journalists and families of those who work for the BBC Persia service live under constant threat. That's right. The organisation responsible for those acts is the IRGC, working for the Iranian regime, and therefore can I ask my right friend that he will look to see what further measures can be taken which should include outlawing the IRGC.
I'm happy to reassure my right honourable friend that we are actively in dialogue as we speak with our international partners following the G7 call yesterday to coordinate further diplomatic measures to contain the threat from Iran.
Seema Malhotra.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the core issue now must be the de-escalation and an immediate ceasefire on all sides, ending the devastating situation in Gaza and a political solution for the long term. UNRWA is arguably the biggest single multilateral tool to support a political solution and is unmatched in its administrative ability to deliver aid. The UK stands behind other countries in not renewing funding to UNRWA. So further to the previous question from my honourable friend, could the Prime Minister set out a clear path for funding to resume?
I just refer the honourable lady to my previous answer. I don't think it's right to say that we're behind other countries. We're in active dialogue with other countries on the approach to UNRWA, recognise the role that they do play operationally and logistically on the ground, but also recognising the very shocking concerns that all of us had about what happened previously. It's right that we take the time to get our future approach to UNRWA right.
Philip Dunn.
I welcome the Prime Minister's focus on calls for restraint and de-escalation, and I imagine that will be on his agenda this afternoon when he speaks to the Israeli Prime Minister. I also welcome his highlighting of the greater threats to this country. In light of that, could he, and recognising what he said earlier today about the future defence budget, could he undertake an immediate review of the resources and resilience of the British Armed Forces in the immediate term?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm happy to tell my honourable friend that we do keep these things under constant review to make sure that we have the capabilities that we need to protect our country and stand up for our valued interests around the world. One thing that is clear is recent conflicts in Ukraine specifically has shown is how technology is changing warfare, which is why our increased focus on autonomous vehicles is so welcome, and including building up our UK industrial supply chain. These are things that we need to focus on. I'm delighted the Defence Secretary has prioritised those areas.
Hal Williams.
Isn't there a danger that a further military attack on Iran would serve to entrench the despotic regime in Tehran and strengthen its ability to oppress its own people, Iranian women, the Kurdish community, the Baha'is and many, many others?
Of its own citizens is appalling, and we've repeatedly condemned them and called them out for that.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Last week I met with students at Woodbrook Vale School and Delisle College in Loughborough. Their question on this topic is now even more important than it was when they put it to me last week. What more can the United Kingdom do to help bring peace to this region?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'd point my honourable friend to the statement. I think first and foremost we have to be resolute in protecting regional security and standing up for Israel when situations like this happen. Secondly, we have to be committed to a two-state solution, which we are doing everything we can to bring that about, and I think the regional cooperation over the weekend demonstrated there's much to be hopeful for. And thirdly, we must see an immediate humanitarian pause in Gaza so we can get the hostages out and aid in. That's the British approach, it's the right approach, and we'll work very hard to bring it about.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has warned that Europe is in a pre-war era because of the situation in Russia. The Prime Minister rightly said that these were not mutually exclusive conflicts but interlinked, and therefore it is important that we coordinate. Just as we have seen there has been coordination at the United Nations, he will be aware of the very real concern that the UN sanctions regime on both Iran and Russia is being undermined. Now, the UN has combined together to support a ceasefire and to call for that. What more is he doing to make sure that the UN works for sanctions on both Russia and Iran? Does he recognise that waiting until June for the G7 to act may be too long in a situation where every single day counts to stop further military action?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, what I was talking about with the G7 was regard to Russian assets, where obviously the G7 has an outsized economic role that it can play. So it's important that there is G7 coordination first and foremost. Specifically to target sanctions evasion. She's right that it's a growing issue and one that I can reassure her we are tackling together with our allies.
James Morris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Notwithstanding the drones and the missiles which were launched by Iran and quite rightly taken out by UK planes and our allies, they prefer to operate in the shadows through proxies and through an increasingly sophisticated cyber operation. So would the Prime Minister agree with me that our priority should be working with international allies to go after where Iran is promoting illicit finance and weapons smuggling, as well as working with our international partners to combat their cyber operations?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. I can reassure him we are working closely with international partners, not least on cyber, but also on weapons smuggling. As I said, I'm pleased that the Royal Navy is playing a significant role in combating that with interdictions of illegal arms shipments both last year and the year before, and contributing as we speak to Operation Prosperity Guardian.
Andy McDonnell.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I just point out to the Prime Minister that a nation-state having the capacity to observe international humanitarian law is quite different to actually doing so. But at this terrifying moment for the world, I think we're all mightily relieved that Iran, which must be condemned for what it did, failed in inflicting serious loss of life on people in the region. And the de-escalation call is correct, as is the commitment not to engage in offensive action. But it was explicit in his statement that all people are entitled to security and peace. But sadly for the people of Gaza, the calls for restraint have not worked. So what additional options is he considering? Because surely an immediate ceasefire, the funding of UNRWA, is the best way to secure security for the region and also the release of all the hostages?
Prime Minister.
Well, it's important that the hostages are released, and that's what we continue to call for. And as the honourable gentleman knows, it was Hamas yet again this weekend that rejected the latest round of negotiations to get those hostages back to safety.
I am anxious to be able to get everybody in, so I would plead for a brevity in the questions, please. Thank you. Jack Lepresti.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I place on the record my condolences to the Speaker and his family? Could I commend the Prime Minister for his statement and the leadership he has shown? But given this despicable attack on the civilian population of Israel by Iran, does he agree with me that the world cannot risk a nuclear-armed Iran? And will he commit to the House today that he will support whatever it takes, including not taking military action off the table, to ensure that this nightmare never happens?
Well, as I said, there's no credible civilian justification for the enrichment levels that we've seen the IAEA has reported are happening in Iran. We're committed to using all diplomatic tools to ensure that Iran doesn't develop a nuclear weapon, including using the snapback mechanism if necessary.
Neil Hanley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I oppose all acts of violence, and I welcome the Prime Minister's calls for de-escalation and restraint. But I can't be the only person who wonders where those calls for de-escalation and restraint were 6 months ago. And given those calls, does he share my concerns that the political fortunes of Prime Minister Netanyahu, in whose hands such a choice rests, are so heavily invested in the continuation of conflict?
We've continued to call on the Israeli government to do everything it can to protect civilian life as it exercises its indeed right and duty to ensure security for its citizens, and I'll continue to raise those points with Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Bob Blackman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, effectively over the weekend, Iran declared war on our friend and ally Israel. And clearly when the Prime Minister talks to Prime Minister Netanyahu, he's going to have to be very careful about how he persuades him to exercise self-restraint. So clearly a menu of options has to be what the British government and what the British people are going to do in assisting Israel in resisting Iran. So the proscription of the IRGC, the removal of the embassy here and return of all those officials to Iran, our officials returning to the United Kingdom, and the harshest possible sanctions against the regime in Iran are the fundamentals that are required.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we have already sanctioned over 400 different Iranian individuals and entities, including the IRGC in its entirety, and we continue to discuss with international partners how best we can coordinate future actions.
Alex Davis-Jones.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Everyone in this House is united in wanting to see the fighting in Gaza come to an end as soon as possible, with a sustainable ceasefire in place. As the Prime Minister quite rightly states, it was once again Hamas who had rejected a US broker deal which would see the fighting stop, hostages released, and allow far more aid to get into Gaza. So what pressure is the government applying to our allies in the region who provide support to Hamas to urge them to do all they can to make
we're doing everything we can, talking to allies in the region to put pressure on Hamas to accept a deal and get the hostages released. That is the best and most important way we can move towards a sustainable ceasefire that we all want to see.
Steve Double.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for his statement and the clear leadership he's providing on this very important matter. As a beacon of liberal democracy in the region, Israel's security is our security. And it's quite clear from the weekend that serious loss of life was only avoided because of the effectiveness of Israeli defence mechanisms supported by the UK and others. Does the Prime Minister share my concern that those calling for an arms embargo against Israel are not only misguided, but they risk weakening Israel's ability to defend itself and encouraging those who wish Israel harm?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I said, we stand by Israel's right to defend itself. It is important that they continue to abide by international humanitarian law. That will always be important to us, and we continually keep all arms exports under review, and we have one of the strictest regimes anywhere in the world.
Adam Kaiser.
Deputy
Deputy Speaker, the events of the weekend mark a dangerous new chapter in the long history of conflict in the Middle East. Does the Prime Minister accept that proportionality is key and must include the conduct of all parties, including the 192 days of uninterrupted and constant bombardment of Gaza in response to what was, of course, a horrific attack by Hamas? It has now killed over 32,000 civilians in Gaza, a place where children look to the sky, not knowing if aid or bombs are going to fall on them. Is that proportionate, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we continue to support Israel's right to defend itself and ensure security for its citizens. It must do that in accordance with international humanitarian law, and will continue to make that point to the Israelis.
Greg Smith.
Thank you. Madam Deputy Speaker, I join with others in thanking the Prime Minister for his leadership in ensuring that the United Kingdom Government stands shoulder to shoulder with our allies Israel in the face of yet another attack. But will you agree with me that the first and most pressing mission for Israel, so that they can live in safety and security, continues to be the necessity to defeat Hamas? And that will, the harsh reality is, that will require an operation in Rafah. Whilst every step must be taken to protect civilian life, will my right honourable friend agree with me that that is the path to peace in the Middle East?
Sir.
My honourable friend is right to highlight the threat that Hamas poses to the security and safety of the people of Israel. The Foreign Secretary set out in detail our view on the right approach to Rafah from this point forward just a couple of weeks ago.
Andy Slaughter.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Prime Minister rightly calls for restraint and de-escalation in the Middle East. Isn't there more chance that his words will carry weight if they advocate a ceasefire by all sides, including the warring parties in Gaza?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we have called for an immediate humanitarian pause in Gaza so that hostages can be released, aid can go in, and for that to form the basis of a more lasting and sustainable ceasefire.
Lefebvre.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for his strong international leadership in this area and for his calls for restraint. The Prime Minister will agree that Iran is the dangerous and destabilising player in this region, whether by themselves directly or through their proxies. It's also a despotic medieval regime. There were 853 executions last year, an 8-year high, including 22 women and young women. So as the Prime Minister works urgently with the G7, please would he confirm that no reasonable option should be off the table, including the possible prescription of the IRGC?
Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Iran's human rights record remains completely unacceptable. We've sanctioned almost 100 entities and individuals specifically for human rights violations. For example, we condemn its surging use of the death penalty, and at the 78th UN General Assembly, we co-sponsored the Iran Human Rights Resolution calling for Iran to issue a moratorium on executions.
Once again, can I say I am anxious to get everybody in, but I can only do that if the questions are brief. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 33,000 people have died in Gaza. More bombs have been dropped there than were dropped in the whole of the Iraq War. This weekend's horrific events show just how dangerous it is that there's going to be an escalation into war across the whole region. Does the Prime Minister recognise that the central kernel to the whole issue across the region is the continued Israeli occupation of Palestine? What will he say about bringing about an end to that occupation and a permanent ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
Madam Deputy Speaker, of course we want to see and remain committed to a two-state solution and working hard to bring that about. But the biggest impact on regional instability is the pernicious influence of Iran and nobody else.
Kieran Mullen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree that even those that want to link the conflict between Israel and Hamas and their conduct with this attack have to surely recognise that since its inception, for decades, Iran has sought the destruction not only of our way of life, but of Israel and its people, and that we should never hesitate to play our part in preventing that?
Prime Minister.
My honourable friend is absolutely right, and I agree with him wholeheartedly.
Andrew Quin.
Thank you. I also echo the calls for restraint and de-escalation. I was interested in what the Prime Minister said about the diplomatic efforts over the last 6 months with the Palestinian Authority looking towards a two-state solution. Given the issues are settlements, water, access between Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem, what window of opportunity does he think there is with the Netanyahu government to get all parties round the table?
Prime Minister.
Well, it's something we've continually pushed for, and in the meantime, what we've also focused on is building up the technical administrative capability of the Palestinian Authority so they are in a position to provide effective and strong governance for West Bank and Gaza when the moment arrives, when that is possible, something we work very hard to bring about.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Yesterday, the United Nations Secretary said the Middle East is on the brink. The people of the region are confronting a real danger of devastating, full-scale conflict, and now is the time to defuse and de-escalate. Does the Prime Minister agree with the United Nations Secretary? And if so, what is the Government Secretary to achieve this as he works with our international allies?
Prime Minister.
Well, of course, we do want to avoid further escalation and bloodshed, which would be deeply destabilising for the region and risk more lives, and that's a message that all government ministers will be taking to their counterparts across the region.
Harry Gardner.
Iran sought to justify its unjustifiable attack on Israel on the basis that it was retaliating for Israel's attack on its consulate. I welcome the fact that the Prime Minister has said that in his telephone conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu later today, he will be urging de-escalation. In that telephone conversation, will he set out the measures that the UK will take if, in fact, Israel seeks to retaliate further?
Prime Minister.
So I'm not going to comment on hypotheticals, but we will, of course, calm heads to prevail everywhere across the region.
Beth Winter.
Diolch yn fawr, Madam Deputy Speaker. At the Security Council last night, the UN General Secretary did warn of the danger of devastating full-scale conflict and called for de-escalation and maximum restraint. And today, in response, the Foreign Secretary has said there could have been thousands of casualties and pressure for an escalation of this conflict. Does the Prime Minister agree with this? And does the Prime Minister also agree that the very real tens of thousands of deaths and casualties Israel's military attacks and imposed famine conditions have caused in Gaza are drivers of regional instability?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we want to avoid further escalation and bloodshed, which would be deeply destabilising for the region and risk more lives, which is why we're calling on all regional partners to focus on being calm and de-escalating the situation.
Alison Toulis.
My constituent Sama has been trying to get her mother, her father and her brother out of Gaza since this conflict began. They've been displaced multiple times. They are now in a tent in Rafah. They cannot apply. There is no scheme for them to come to safety in the UK. And the UK government has this in its hands. It could waive the need for biometrics if the government so decided to. Will the Prime Minister do this and let Sama's family come to safety?
Obviously, I'm not aware of the specifics of the Honourable Lady's case, but I'm sure if she writes to the Home Office, they'll be happy to look into it for her.
Hamid Yassin.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. 4 former UK Supreme Court judges and more than 600 lawyers, including over 60 cases, have warned the Prime Minister that the UK risks breaking international law over a plausible risk of genocide in Gaza if it does not stop its weapons export to Israel. But the Prime Minister is ignoring their warnings and hiding his own government's legal advice on this matter. Why, Prime Minister?
Prime Minister.
No, that's not right, Madam Deputy Speaker. So we have a very robust and rigorous export licensing regime. The Foreign Secretary confirmed last week that the UK's position on export licences is unchanged following the latest assessment and in line with the legal advice. We keep that position under review and always act in accordance with that advice.
Abby Abrahams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Middle East has entered a very dangerous new phase, which can only be resolved by diplomatic and political solutions. So can I push the Prime Minister on what he said earlier in terms of the sanctions that he is considering with international allies in relation to Iran, including the prescribing of the IRGC? And will he also confirm that the UK will not be taking part in any offensive action of Israel's?
Madam Deputy Speaker, no, we acted in a defensive capacity and we're discussing with G7 allies further diplomatic measures that can be taken in a coordinated fashion.
Stephen Fareham.
Iran's attack on Israel and the nature of the Iranian regime. The Prime Minister says he wants to see stability in the region, but surely there must be honesty and transparency that Israel itself is a threat to stability and has already systematically broken international humanitarian law. The government has no reluctance in rightly challenging Russia over Ukraine in that regard, but why the reluctance in relation to Israel and indeed to publish the associate legal advice?
Minister.
I said I don't think there's any equivalence between what Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine and what Israel is doing to ensure the security of its citizens in the face of an appalling terrorist attack.
Christian Wakeford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's been over 15 months since it was reported that prescription of the IRGC was imminent. Since then, Iran has continued to fund and supply Hamas, Iran has continued to fund and supply Hezbollah, and Iran has continued to fund and supply the Houthis. Following this continued funding for terror and destabilisation, what more does Iran have to do before the IRGC is prescribed?
Prime Minister.
As I said, the police, security services and courts all have the tools they need to sanction, prosecute and mitigate the threats from Iran. We've strengthened our Iran sanctions regime recently and the IRGC is sanctioned in its entirety.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister said in his statement that it was important that aid gets into Gaza, and then he said a few moments ago that the government was right to take its time to decide on the restoration of funding to UNRWA. Madam Deputy Speaker, the organisational infrastructure of UNRWA is unparalleled and it cannot be replicated. A further delay on the part of the UK Government will cost further lives in a context in which famine is taking hold. Can I urge the Prime Minister to think again and to set out a path today for the restoration of funding to UNRWA?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I know the whole House will have rightly been appalled by the allegations that UNRWA staff were involved in October 7th. We want UNRWA to give detailed undertakings about changes in personnel policy and procedures to ensure that nothing like that could ever happen again. We're working actively with allies to try and bring about this situation to a rapid conclusion. I'll just say we're expecting final reports from the UN and others into what happened by the end of April this month, and then intend to clarify the UK's position on funding once we've reviewed those final reports.
O'Hara.
Speaker, Israel has indicated that against the advice of the international community, including the UN and the United States, that it intends to respond to Iran's attack. Such a retaliation could tip the region into a catastrophic all-out war. So when persuading Prime Minister Netanyahu against further retaliation, and in terms of leverage, will he say to Israel that should they choose to escalate, there will be no further UK military support for Israel's endeavours in this conflict?
I'm sure the honourable gentleman meant to also condemn Iran for what happened over the weekend, but we will continue to urge de-escalation and calm heads to prevail on all sides.
Tamarjeet Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Speaker. Iran is, of course, no ally of the UK, and its huge, unprecedented assault on Israel must be called out. But the UK government must now work hard to prevent further escalation of the crisis in an already volatile region. Now, it is a matter of principle that diplomatic premises are not targeted. So can the Prime Minister confirm what conversations he has had with the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu about the attack on the Iranian consulate in Syria, and whether he plans to discuss that with him?
As I said, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will continue to urge de-escalation and calm heads to prevail on all sides. And as Foreign Secretary said this morning, we would urge Israel in particular to recognise that it successfully repelled the Iranian attacks and Iran is ever more isolated on the world stage.
Kerry McCarthy.
Thank you. Jackie, the mother of the murdered aid worker, James Kirby, is my constituent, and I'm sure she'll agree with the Prime Minister's description of him as a hero. But there's a real danger, which I'm already seeing as events move on, that his death will end up just being chalked up as collateral damage in this conflict. So can I ask the Prime Minister to really show that he understands that the family need to see justice done, and can he keep up the pressure on Israel about this review? They want to know why he was killed and that someone will be held responsible.
Prime Minister.
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, my condolences to Jackie and the families of all those that were tragically killed as they were delivering aid. As I said, they were heroes and they absolutely deserve our admiration, and our thoughts will be with all their families. I'll refer her to my previous answer about what we've asked of the Israelis, and what's crystal clear though is there needs to be a considerable improvement in the deconfliction mechanisms between Israel and aid agencies. That's crystal clear. I've made that point already to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and we expect to see that followed through.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I join my right honourable friend from Kingston and Surbiton in unequivocally condemning the action of the Iranian regime on Saturday and in supporting our RAF in their actions. But my constituents in Edinburgh West, like many others, are concerned that now attention will be taken away from the plight of the Palestinians in Gaza. So can the Prime Minister assure us that when he speaks to the Prime Minister of Israel later today, he impresses upon him not only the need for restraint to restabilise the region, but that he has a unique opportunity now to take steps towards peace by making a gesture with promoting a ceasefire and allowing aid into Gaza?
Our position remains unchanged. We continue to want to see an immediate humanitarian pause, so hostages are released, aid goes in, and immediately we want Israel to deliver on its commitments to significantly increase the amount of aid getting into Gaza on the various measures that they've set out.
Toby Perkins.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the question from the right honourable member from North Somerset exposed that there is much more that we could be doing to undermine the murderous Iranian regime. Simultaneously, the way that Israel continues to ignore the United Nations resolutions deeply troubling. Is the Prime Minister worried that his approach risks failing both on Iran and on Israel at the moment?
No. No, Madam Deputy Speaker. As we've demonstrated this weekend, the UK is leading with allies, defending our values and our interests, standing together with our friends to bring about regional security. That's good for people in the region, and it's good for people here at home too.
Dr. Rupert Huck.
Iran's reckless actions only add more fuel on an already raging fire. So can I ask the Prime Minister, will he prescribe the IRG, and what assessment has he made of whether bombing a consulate violates international law? What are we doing to uphold this principle in a war that's gone on 6 months and cost so many lives?
Refer the Honourable Lady to any of my previous answers on both of those topics.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In response to my honourable friend, the Prime Minister said he would take the time to set future approach to UNRWA right. So as the famine continues, I wonder, Prime Minister, how much time he actually needs before he makes up his mind to restore funding and get aid to the people who need it.
Prime Minister.
What the Honourable Lady failed to mention was the shocking allegations of people being involved in UNRWA, being involved in the massacre on October 7th. It is right that that is properly investigated and new procedures are put in place to ensure that that could never happen again. Those final reports which have been commissioned are due at the end of April. Once we review those, and we're already in dialogue with our partners, we'll set out our future approach. But that's not to say we are not already doing an enormous amount to bring more aid into the region. We've tripled our commitment and right now are delivering aid by land, sea and air. We're taking a leading role, and everyone in this House should be incredibly proud of what the UK is bringing to the table.
Claudia Webb.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The action of the Royal Air Force in shooting down Iranian drones and cruise missiles heading to and over Israel over the weekend raises a very serious question. Since the UK is clearly capable of acting to prevent airstrikes in both the region, and both the ICJ and the UN Special Rapporteur for Palestine and the occupied territories have implicated Israel in a genocide in Gaza, why isn't the government interested in fulfilling its obligations under international law by protecting Palestinian women and children from Israeli airstrikes? Why isn't the government acting to prevent the killing of Palestinians?
Well, I just disagree with the Honourable Lady. Whilst, of course, we respect the role and the independence of the ICJ, our view is that Israel's actions in Gaza can simply not be described as a genocide, and that case is not helpful at all in achieving our goal of a sustainable and lasting ceasefire.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The threat of imminent famine hangs over the people of Gaza. Aid urgently needs to get into the country and to be safely distributed. Will the Prime Minister confirm, with the death of those 3 UK charity workers working for World Central Kitchen, has he received a written apology from the Prime Minister of Israel?
I spoke explicitly to the Prime Minister of Israel, who did that when I spoke to him the very next day. We've made absolutely crystal clear our concerns about what's happened, and as I previously pointed out, are looking now through the preliminary findings. Pleased to see the early dismissal of suspension of 2 officers involved, and now what we need is reform of Israel's deconfliction mechanism to ensure the future safety of aid workers.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In speaking to the Prime Minister of Israel this evening, in calling for restraint, will he put that into action? So should the Prime Minister say that he will further assaults in Gaza or indeed impede aid, will he action that restraint and call for immediate ceasefire?
Prime Minister.
We've already called for an immediate humanitarian pause so more aid can get in and hostages can be released. And we ourselves, as I said, tripled our aid commitment and bringing aid in by air, land and sea together with our allies.
Alan Brown.
Madam Deputy Speaker, so there's been over 33,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza, including 14,000 children, 76,000 civilians injured or maimed, 700 healthcare and aid workers killed. And given there's the ongoing famine, which the UK government under his watch is now trying to find ways around the Israeli blockade that's preventing aid getting in, isn't that in itself an admission that ongoing Israeli actions are disproportionate and shouldn't be calling it out as such?
Prime Minister.
We've been consistently clear that we are concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza, have called on the Israelis to open up more aid corridors and have them open more often. They set out a series of steps just recently, and now we want to see them deliver on those.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Middle East is in a crisis, and myself and thousands of my Riverside constituents have been calling for a ceasefire to end the destruction in Gaza and prevent the widening conflict in the Middle East. The Prime Minister has talked about diplomatic action towards a two-state solution. Can he say what action he's taken against the far-right ministers in the Israeli government who are opposed to a two-state solution?
Prime Minister.
Well, we've been very clear that our view is that we should have a two-state solution, and we're making sure we do everything we can to contribute to that aim.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. On the wider humanitarian crisis in Gaza, there is now a famine across the area, and in response to a number of questions from my honourable friend, the Prime Minister said that, I think he said, that he's now received the interim report on UNRWA and that in due course he'll receive the final report. Will he publish the interim report, and if not, why not? And with Canada, France, Finland, Australia, Sweden and the EU having now restored funding, why does the UK stand alone?
Minister.
When it comes to UNRWA, it's the UN that is with publishing the expected final reports towards the end of April, and after receiving those, we will clarify and set out the UK's position on future funding.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all thank the Prime Minister very much for his decisive action, his support for Israel, and thank our world-class Royal Air Force for preventing the further loss of life. Just last week I had an opportunity to be in Israel, to visit the kibbutz where the people were murdered, innocent Jews, to go to the Nova musical festival where over 1,000 Israelis were murdered, and to speak to some of those families. So in relation to Hamas and their sponsorship, the IRGC, does the Prime Minister agree that Hamas and IRGC can be likened to cancer, and to save life throughout the Middle East and retain stability, that the cancer of Hamas and IRGC needs to be removed urgently by all means necessary?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman is right to point out the destabilising impact of Iran across the region, including action through proxies like Hamas, the Houthis and others, and we'll do everything we can to counter that threat.
Richard Ford.
Thank you. Our constituents will always want us to think about second-order consequences of British military action. When the government deployed the RAF to defend civilians in Libya, a full parliamentary debate was held afterwards and a vote was granted to members of this House. This was in line with the convention that has been observed for most of the last 20 years. Will the government grant members a full debate and a vote on British military action, even after the action has happened?
No, Madam Speaker, I don't believe that's necessary. I'm obviously here answering questions. It's my job to take action where I believe it is necessary, and it's this job of Parliament to hold me accountable for that. But it was right that we move quickly to respond to an immediate and dangerous threat. Publicising any action in advance would undermine the effectiveness of the operation. We acted in line with precedent, and we've also made very clear in public statements that we will not hesitate to protect our allies.
I thank the Prime Minister for his statement, and I suspect there'll be a slight change of personnel before we move